Welcome back, everyone. Real quick, hopefully, we're gonna go ahead and write the FDA a comment about cannabis plant and resin. And in fact, we have until October 31st to do that. You can hit the comment now button on this page. I'm going to provide the link in the description below, and you're going to get this thing that pops up here. And it's going to basically ask about, what your comment is, and specifically this is I'm going to tell you all about this real quick, but I highly encourage everybody to do it. Tell everybody you know to do it, and yeah, that's pretty much what this video is about. Now, there's this thing called the Convention on Psychotropic Substances and the International Drug Scheduling. There's also a single convention on narcotic drugs. Those are why we in America have a scheduling system, and why cannabis is on Schedule 1, and why whenever we asked the DEA if they would reschedule cannabis, they basically said, we would, but then we'd be breaking these treaties that we have with the United Nations and those commissions I just mentioned. Well, maybe if they change their minds, maybe the DEA can change their mind. That'd be cool. And meanwhile, by the way, if you think about it, that's the only treaties that the United States follows to the letter. For some reason, we just love those treaties. We love the United Nations treaties that tell us to have ridiculous prohibition on substances, which doesn't make any sense. It's never worked. Alcohol was the experiment that we all should have learned a lesson from, the lesson being that prohibition doesn't work. You can do all these fancy things and try to make laws and rules and designate substances as this and that, but what you can't do is you can't control the substances. So just by calling it the Controlled Substances Act, you already lost. And let me just go ahead and read the summary of this Regulations.Gov memo. It's a notice, and it's a request for comments. The Food and Drug Administration is requesting interested persons to submit comments concerning abuse potential, actual abuse, medical usefulness, trafficking, and impact of scheduling changes on availability for medical use of 16 substances. These comments will be considered in preparing a response from the United States to the World Health Organization regarding the abuse, liability, and diversion of these drugs, who will use this information to consider whether to recommend that certain international restrictions be placed on these drugs. This notice requesting comments is required by the Controlled Substances Act. Now, a couple things I want to comment on before we move along. So when you think about it, this is about all these drugs, this whole list. But none of these drugs are really going to get the kind of activism behind them that this one is. All right? And when I say that, I mean fentanyl. Oh my God, why wouldn't more people be wanting to know about fentanyl or talk about that? Because they don't have to. Or tramadol. the thing that people are going to comment about is cannabis, by and large. And I'm not just talking about people like you and me. Look at what they want again. They want to know about abuse potential, actual abuse, medical usefulness, trafficking, and impact of scheduling changes. I guarantee you, and we just seen Sam and a bunch of other people having a meeting with a bunch of doctors, and they were all prohibitionists, but it was to try to talk about, something to do with cannabis. Now, the thing about it is, well, they were talking about how, for some reason, the whole symposium was talking about how the legalization of cannabis has actually caused an increase in opioid deaths, which can't be further from the truth. It's just ridiculous and absurd. But anyway, those people are probably getting together so that they can compile, like, they can do some brainstorming and they can come up with, you know, talking points and shit like that, so that they can make comments to this thing here. And when I say they, I mean they and everybody that they can get to do it. On the professional capacity and in the professional world, we're seeing authors who used to be cannabis authors that appeared to be pro-cannabis are now starting to engage in this new form of reefer madness, where they're like, oh, you know, marijuana's not that bad. Maybe it shouldn't even be, you know, illegal, but it is bad, and it did ruin my life, and it, you know, it's addictive, and it causes psychosis, and all the other regular, everyday reefer madness things that we've been hearing for 80 years. So, and we haven't really seen much proof of. So anyway, moving along, they're going to make comments. They're going to show up. So I suggest you show up. I suggest you make a comment. I suggest everybody that's watching this video tell all your friends that you know about it that smoke weed. It's your responsibility as somebody that smokes weed to at least do one thing in your life to try to help in the effort to change the prohibition status. That's all I ask for. Is that too much to ask? I don't know. If all it is hitting a like and a share button, that's good enough for me. So, like, that's that. I'm going to read the article from Tom Angel about this, just so you can get a better view of why, you know, why anybody, any old person that wants to make a comment can make a comment. You don't have to be some kind of expert or whatever, and you'll see that basically the tone that we're looking for is like, we know that it helps people, so tell them how it helped you. Tell them how it improved your life. And once you do that, you know, and what I've seen on Twitter, I don't know if I'm going to do this or not, but a lot of people on Twitter are doing, like, they're polling their audience, you know, like, hey, what do you guys think, you know? And it's a pretty good idea. It's like, so you can get a kind of a temperature in the room of what people are saying or how they're feeling about it. And yeah, that might be something I look into. But anyway, here's Tom Angel. If you don't know about him, check him out at marijuanamoment.net. Here he is writing for Forbes. The federal government wants your input on whether marijuana should be reclassified under global drug treaties to which the U.S. is a party. Specifically, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration is asking for public comments about the abuse potential, actual abuse, medical usefulness, trafficking, and impact of scheduling changes on the availability of medical use of cannabis and several other substances now under international review. So, if you haven't figured it out yet by now, the tone of this whole comment section that they're asking about is in the vein of a rescheduling effort, not a removing from the schedule altogether type thing. The FDA would never ask for that, believe me. But, you know, and what I've heard around the campfire of the, you know, the overall topic of discussion would be that, you know, medical marijuana could potentially be something that the FDA would consider for a Schedule 2. Duh. We don't want that, though. We don't even want it in the CSA whatsoever. But for the sake of their arguing and this whole, like, we got to slowly tiptoe towards the finish line, we definitely would do anything to get it out of Schedule 1, I guess. And knowing that Schedule 1 isn't or shouldn't be thought of as some kind of a permanent positioning for cannabis, then we can also assume that if it did make it to Schedule 2, that would also not be some kind of a permanent designation for cannabis. Because by all means, it shouldn't be. If you look at the criteria for Schedule 2, and again, it has the abuse potential and addictiveness, marijuana just doesn't seem to fit that profile. But we're going to have a hard time convincing anybody out there of that, apparently, because of the stigma and the amount of people in the medical profession that still, for whatever reason, whether they're paid to be ignorant or just choose to be ignorant or have a hubris to be ignorant, yeah, it's going to take a lot to get that ball across the line. Back to the article. Under the current U.S. federal law as well as global drug policy agreements, marijuana is classified in the most restrictive category of Schedule 1. At home, it means it is considered illegal and not available for prescription, while research on its potential benefits is heavily restricted. Cannabis international status means that nations who are signatories of drug control treaties are not supposed to legalize it, though that hasn't stopped Canada and Uruguay from doing so. Public comments on marijuana's effects and legal status, quote, will be considered in preparing a response from the United States to the World Health Organization regarding the abuse, liability, and diversion of these drugs. Leslie Cucks, FDA's Associate Commissioner for Policy, wrote in the Federal Register filing published on Wednesday. Quote, who will use this information to consider whether to recommend that certain international restrictions be placed on these drugs. WHO's Expert Committee on Drug Dependence, ECDD, is meeting in Geneva next month to consider the classification of marijuana and other substances and is now seeking to, quote, gather information on the legitimate use, harmful use, status of national control, and potential impact of international control, the United Nations body said in a notice exerted in the FDA filing. Earlier this year, ECDD determined that the cannabidiol, CBD, a component of marijuana shown to have medical benefits without intoxicating properties like other cannabinoids such as THC, should not be scheduled under international drug control conventions. Quote, CBD has been found to be generally well tolerated with a good safety profile, the UN body found in its critical review. There is no evidence that CBD as a substance is liable to similar abuse and similar ill effects as substances such as cannabis or THC, respectively. The committee recommended that preparations considered to be pure CBD should not be scheduled. Did you hear that, DEA? The body also agreed to, and by the way, people that are wondering about the DEA and why they're so stuck on keeping CBD in Schedule 1, which they are in case you think they're not, it's because they said a long time ago, and I did a clip about it, that you can't, in the opinion of the DEA, you can't make plant-based CBD without some kind of trace element of THC still being in there, which I call complete bullshit on. And then they walked that back and said that any oil extracts from the plant or leaves, or they basically redefine what different components of marijuana plants are, which they never did before, but that was just so they could still say CBD should be on Schedule 1 because it's some kind of a resin or an oil or whatever, rather than just something like they have exceptions to what isn't considered marijuana, which would be like the seed cakes or seeds or roots. So whatever, man. Anyway, enough on the DEA. I don't think they'll ever come around. They'll be the last people kicking and screaming, because that's their job. The body also agreed to undergo an in-depth critical review of the marijuana plant and its resins and extracts, as well as THC itself. The new review is what triggered the FDA's request for public comment on Wednesday. So don't let it fool you guys. They're actually asking about the efficacy of THC. So let them know, you know. And like Alexis Bortel, she swears by THC because she still had seizures just using the CBD only stuff, or the really high CBD and hardly any THC, if they were even talking about that. The Trump administration sought public comments from interested parties in advance of an earlier UN pre-review on marijuana as well. In case you were confused and you thought all this already happened, that was just a that was just for their own purposes. That wasn't the one that they're going to actually submit to the UN. This one will be, all these comments will be used to make the FDA's actual comment. So I guess they were just trying to determine on whether or not they were even going to participate in this. But since the Controlled Substances Act requires it, I don't think they can really wiggle their way out of it. So anyway, any comments received will be considered by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services when it prepares a scientific and medical evaluation for drug substances that is responsive to the WHO questionnaire for these drug substances. Essentially, like I said, they're just going to take the comments and be like, okay, now we can answer the WHO questionnaire with the full backing of the opinions, of the testimonies that we received and read. So again, I emphasize and I encourage people to give them your testimony about what THC has done for you, or resins or extracts or the whole plant, whatever, because there's going to be a lot of people from SAM, and there's going to be a lot of these Republican think tanks that have people that go out and write comments. There's going to be a lot of comments coming in that are going to talk about how addictive it is and how it's going to get diverted into middle schools and all this other crap. So please comment. All right, back to the article. HHHS will forward such evaluation of these drug substances to WHO for WHO's consideration in deciding whether to recommend international control or decontrol of any of these drugs or substances. Legalization advocates are hopeful that a hard look at the data on marijuana's effects will inevitably lead to a pro-reform conclusion. Quote, a careful review of the relevant science does not now, nor has it ever, supported a hardline approach to cannabis scheduling. Cannabis's abuse potential relative to other substances, including legal substances like alcohol, tobacco, and prescription medications, does not warrant its continued criminalization under either U.S. or international law. Paul Armentano, Deputy Director of NORML, said in an email, quote, by any rational assessment, cannabis prohibition is a disproportionate public policy response to behavior that is, at worst, a public health concern, but should not be a criminal justice matter, and international laws should no longer classify it as such. And I would argue, respectively, that sure, you could call it a public health concern in its worst case scenario, but I don't think we've ever seen that. I don't think we've ever seen a situation where, like, entire populations were just beat down and drugged out because they were all hooked on marijuana. It just doesn't sound like anything we've ever heard of. So public health concern, man, I don't know. If it is, then why don't they focus on that? If it's a public health concern, how come they're not doing anything to address what they call public health concerns? Because, I mean, whenever they identify something like a public health concern, like, oh, emergency room spikes because too many kids eating brownies. Well, instead of what they would do about that is they want to do total prohibition, which is not how you do anything about that. That's not how you fix a problem like that. Actually, the answer to that problem is education. Educate people that you don't have to take someone to the emergency room when they eat too much THC. And let's not continue to call that an overdose, please. Mason Tavert, spokesman for the Marijuana Policy Project, agreed, quote, the time has come for marijuana to be removed from the federal drug schedules. There is no longer any doubt that it has significant medical value, and the science is clear that it is less harmful than many legal medical products, he said. While marijuana is not harmless, few, if any, products are, it poses less harm than alcohol to consumers and to society. The U.S. led the world into a quagmire of cannabis prohibition, so it should lead the world out of it by descheduling cannabis and implementing a more evidence-based policy. I agree almost completely with that as well, but as usual, I will respectfully ask, what is these harms that people are always talking about? He says, while marijuana is not harmless. Every time I ask people, what is the harms? They stop and they just really can't figure it out. Or they revert to some kind of thing that they heard on some anti-marijuana prohibition type commercial or something. All right. That said, the feds aren't planning to make any cannabis recommendations to the UN panel ahead of its review meeting next month. Quote, instead, HHS will defer such consideration until WHO has made official recommendations to the Commission on Narcotic Drugs, which are expected to be made in mid-2018. the Federal Register notice says. Any HHS position regarding international control of these drug substances will be preceded by another Federal Register notice soliciting public comments. In addition to marijuana and its components, the WHO committee is also reviewing several synthetic cannabinoids, fentanyls, and other substances. FDA has hinted that international rescheduling of marijuana and its components could influence changes to its legal status here at home. This month, FDA publicly released a letter it sent to the Drug Enforcement Administration earlier this year suggesting that CBD should be completely removed from the federal control. Cannabidiol has a, quote, negligible potential for abuse and has, quote, currently accepted medical use and treatment, the agency found. That should be enough. And by the way, negligible potential for abuse? How come you can just... why don't you just be, like, concise with your wording? I don't think there's any potential for abusing cannabidiol. But if your body needs it, you might want to take more than you can afford. And I mean, gambling really wouldn't be a problem if you had endless supplies of money to gamble with, now would it? So I don't really see what the potential for abuse is. Because of the international drug treaty obligations, FDA conceded that substances need to be scheduled, concluding that it should be placed under the least restrictive category of Schedule 5. Like I said earlier, quote, if the treaty obligations do not require control of CBD or if the international controls on CBD change in the future, this recommendation will need to be promptly revisited, FDA wrote in its analysis to the DEA. That document, dated in May, preceded the WHO's determination that CBD should not be globally scheduled and was part of the federal government's approval and rescheduling last month of a CBD-based drug, Epidiolex, which was used for severe epilepsy disorders. To summarize all that, back in May, the FDA was looking to help their buddies out over at GW Pharmaceuticals and get their little CBD drug approved so they can get making them millions. And you know, while they were in that process, the FDA was trying to make a case for CBD, which it would have never done had there not been somebody pushing their buttons like GW Pharmaceuticals. Come on, for real. Would they have ever been just like, you know what, we've been going hard on CBD for a while, guys, and we know it works because we've seen videos on the internet. I guess maybe we should do something about it? No, of course not. They would never do something like that. That's why they had to be pushed and prodded on THC as well. And they're going to... the DEA will be last, but the FDA will go kicking and screaming all the way to the very last second when they absolutely have to do something. And that's what it's going to be. So get ready for that. And again, in summary, so in May, the FDA, while they were doing all that, sent the DEA a letter that they just told us about last week, telling the DEA maybe we should schedule 5 CBD overall. You know, instead of, and we're talking about overall, not just for Epidiolex. And the DEA was like, nah, sorry guys, you guys helped your buddies over at GW, now we're going to do some helping. And they did the heavy lifting, and keeping it in Schedule 1 and threatening people made it so states that have medical marijuana programs were able to threaten hemp-derived CBD people to shut it down. And it seems like the only place you can get hemp-derived CBD is in states that have total cannabis bans 100%. It's just, I don't know. The irony is weird. I don't know if I like it. I think we need to deschedule all of it, but immediately they need to get rid of the scheduling on CBD so that these hemp-derived CBD products can be made available to anybody that wants to buy them, period. And the price should go down because there's no justification of those high prices for the hemp-derived CBD. And furthermore, I mean, I don't know. Whatever, man. I just don't understand why the DEA is going to be like that. I mean, I do, but I don't know why they can't, why they don't have to really answer to anybody about this. So, anyway, it is not clear why the U.S. government subsequently decided to place FDA-approved CBD medications in the federal Schedule of 5 with an appeal to global treaties that the UN now says shouldn't schedule the substance. Right. For now, the FDA is accepting public comments on marijuana and other substances currently under UN review via web. Until October 31st, interested parties can also submit written comments via email. Ultimately, WHO will make a scheduling recommendation for marijuana to UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, who oversaw the enactment of the drug decriminalization in Portugal as the Prime Minister, a policy he has touted in his current capacity as UN Secretary General. So there you go. As long as WHO gives that recommendation to him, and it looks like, you know, everything that we have been saying for the last 80 plus years about, you know, not making marijuana illegal, they'll have that in front of them. Like, hey, this is not the highly addictive, dangerous, with no medical value substance that you guys have said it was all along, and here's why. You know, nobody's ever died from marijuana, so that right off the bat makes it safer than tobacco and alcohol. We already got that on our side. That's a big deal. That's like saying that you're prohibiting stuff that people are dying from more than any other substances, but somehow marijuana's got to be a schedule. That's just for someone that smokes weed that don't even think about the medical potential, that the potential medical value that it has, or that it's the benefits that it's giving them medically. So if you're just smashing dabs like, I'm just getting stoned, bro, I don't give a shit about medical marijuana, well, guess what? They want to hear your comment too. And you could say that you've been smashing dabs without being like ridiculously addicted and lose your job because you're too lazy to get off the couch and all that shit. I mean, basically, you know, they're going to throw the reefer madness, the people that are against this, against descheduling. They're going to throw reefer madness comments at this. So if your comment just looks like the opposite of a reefer madness talking point, then that's fine, because we need those too. And if you're a doctor who's seen, you know, case after case of medical marijuana working for your patients, they definitely want to hear that. You're somebody that was addicted to opioids and you got out of that by using replacement therapy with medical marijuana. They want to know about that. I want to know about that. I'm going to be reading these comments as they come in. And I'll probably do a video in about a week or so where I read a few of these comments. So again, I would like everybody that watches my show to go comment. That would make me happy. I'll leave the links in the description below. That's all I got on this. Be sure to go comment and have a nice day.